History often forgets the women who ruled from the shadows. We are uncovering the lost stories of 30 influential women in medieval politics, and by the end you will know the secret strategies that built and toppled empires. How did an actress become the most powerful woman in Byzantium? And what really happened when a queen was imprisoned by her own husband for 16 years? These were not damsels in distress but master strategists and diplomats, their legacies wrapped in mystery and deliberate silence. We will meet queens who commanded armies, regents who outmaneuvered kings, and writers who weaponized their words to change the world. What do you think it took to wield power in an age that wanted you powerless? Her story begins not in a palace, but on the stage of Constantinople's Hippodrome. Theodora was born into the lowest social class, her family tied to the bear-keeping and acting professions, which were seen as scandalous and disreputable. Yet this woman would one day stand beside an emperor and alter the course of an empire. Her ascent is a mystery in itself, a tale of extraordinary charisma and political genius that propelled her from the theatrical arena to the very heart of power. When she married the future Emperor Justinian, it was a scandal that shook the aristocracy, but he saw in her not just a partner, but a formidable political mind. She became his empress, and history would prove she was far more than a consort. Her defining moment came during the Nika Riots, a catastrophic uprising that nearly destroyed Justinian's reign. For days, massive crowds burned large parts of Constantinople, demanding the emperor's overthrow. Justinian and his advisors, paralyzed by fear, were ready to flee the city and abandon the throne. It was Theodora who stood before the council and delivered a speech of legendary defiance. She argued that flight was not an option, that imperial purple made a fine shroud, and that they must fight to hold their power. Her unwavering resolve steeled Justinian's nerve. He ordered his generals to crush the rebellion, a move that saved his rule and solidified Theodora's position as a true co-ruler. From that day forward, her influence was absolute and openly acknowledged across the empire. She wielded that power with profound effect, shaping laws, religion, and social policy. Theodora was a relentless advocate for women, pushing for laws that granted them greater rights in divorce, property ownership, and protection from exploitation. She used her influence to support the monophysite Christian faction, often counterbalancing Justinian's own religious policies, effectively creating a parallel diplomatic channel that stabilized the empire's eastern provinces. In the Grand Mosaics of Ravenna, she is depicted with a halo, standing equal to Justinian, a visual testament to her official power. But how do we truly know her? The historical record is a battlefield. One source, the secret historian Procopius, paints her as a vengeful and manipulative schemer, while official chronicles celebrate her piety and strength. This duality is the central mystery of Theodora. Was she a saintly reformer using her hard-won power for good, or a brilliantly cunning political operator who mastered the system that once scorned her? Perhaps she was both, a woman who understood that in a world designed to break her, only absolute influence could guarantee real change. Theodora's influence reached far beyond the throne room and into the very soul of the empire. Her most enduring and controversial legacy was her fierce, unwavering support for the monophysite Christian doctrine, a belief that Christ had a single, divine nature, which the official church in Constantinople condemned as heresy. While Emperor Justinian worked to enforce Orthodox unity, Theodora actively sheltered monophysite bishops, funded their monasteries, and even installed a sympathetic patriarch in the capital. This created a remarkable and tense duality at the heart of Byzantine power. She essentially ran a parallel religious diplomacy, maintaining critical links with the eastern provinces of the empire where monophysitism was deeply popular, acting as a balancing force that may have prevented greater unrest. To the established church hierarchy, this was a profound scandal, a queen undermining God's own order, and it is here that the mystery of her historical reputation deepens, shrouded in deliberate venom. Decades after her death, the historian Procopius produced his notorious Secret History, a work so vitriolic it was hidden for centuries. In its pages, Theodora is not a stateswoman but a monster of depravity and cruelty, accused of every conceivable vice. This was not casual gossip, but a calculated political assassination on parchment, a common tool used to dismantle the legacy of powerful women by attacking their morality. So how do we find the real Theodora beneath these layers of praise and slander? Modern historians see Procopius not as a reporter of fact, but as a key to the anxieties she provoked. His outrageous claims reveal less about her personal life and more about the sheer terror her power inspired in the traditional elite. A woman of low birth, wielding absolute authority, challenging the church, and changing laws was an existential threat to the established order. The best evidence of her true character lies not in scandalous stories, but in the concrete policies she championed. Theodora used her hard-won authority to push through groundbreaking laws that protected young girls from forced prostitution and granted women greater rights in divorce, including the right to own property and remarry. Here lies the complex core of her legacy, a ruler who could be both a ruthless political operator in theological wars and a compassionate reformer legislating for society's most vulnerable. She understood that real power was not just about holding the throne, but about reshaping the world from it, a lesson that would echo through the centuries to our next figure, a queen who would find her power not in defiance, but in an astonishing act of surrender. 16 years is a long time to spend in a castle tower. For Eleanor of Aquitaine, those years of confinement followed a spectacular rebellion against her own husband, a king. But to understand that stunning act of defiance, you must first grasp the scale of her power. Eleanor was not a pawn in the Game of Thrones, she was the board itself. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she controlled more land in what is now France than the French king did, a vast and wealthy territory she inherited in her own right. This made her the most desirable bride in Europe, and her first marriage elevated her to Queen of France. Yet that union was ultimately a cage, dissolved on grounds of consanguinity, a polite term for being too closely related. Her true story and her legend began with her second, breathtakingly strategic choice. At the age of 30, an age when most noble women's political lives were considered over, Eleanor chose Henry, Duke of Normandy, and the future King Henry II of England. Together, they forged an empire, the Angevin Empire, that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. She was its queen, and more importantly, she was the sovereign ruler of Aquitaine, a power she never surrendered to him. Her court in Poitiers became a center of culture and political intrigue, famed for the so-called courts of love where tales of chivalry and romance were woven, perhaps as a subtle form of political diplomacy and social instruction. But her ambition was not merely cultural. She took an active, leading role in the Second Crusade, traveling with her first husband, King Louis VII of France. Chronicles from the time, often scandalized by her presence, describe her arriving in Antioch, dressed in armor and riding with her ladies, a vivid image of a queen refusing to be a passive pilgrim. The crusade was a disaster, and it fractured her first marriage, but it also revealed a woman of immense will and political vision, traits that would soon clash violently with her second husband. Henry II was a brilliant, energetic, and notoriously controlling ruler. For years, Eleanor governed their continental lands while he managed England, but as their sons grew older, a deep rift opened. Henry sought to marginalize her and strip their sons of their future inheritances, consolidating all power for himself. Eleanor's response was not quiet diplomacy, it was open war. In 1173, she masterminded a great rebellion with her three eldest sons against their father. This was no simple family quarrel, it was a calculated bid for power, with Eleanor marshalling the lords of Aquitaine and Poitou to her son's cause. The rebellion failed. King Henry, furious and perhaps threatened as never before, captured Eleanor. He did not execute her, for she was too valuable as the living key to Aquitaine, but he removed her from the game completely. For the next 16 years, she was held under guard in various English castles, a prisoner queen. This long imprisonment is one of history's great silences. What was she thinking, planning, feeling as the years passed in those stone rooms? Letters were controlled, visitors monitored. Yet her influence did not vanish, it simply went underground. She remained the symbolic heart of Aquitaine and a potent figure for her sons. When Henry II finally died, it was her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, who freed her. And in that moment, the imprisoned queen transformed once more, this time into the most trusted regent of the realm. While Richard was away on crusade and later held captive, it was Eleanor, now in her 70s, who traversed his kingdoms, raising his ransom and holding his territories secure with a skill born of a lifetime of rule. She even helped secure the succession for her controversial youngest son, John, after Richard's death. The mystery of Eleanor is not a question of whether she was powerful, but of how she wielded that power through so many radical transformations, from queen to rebel, from prisoner to regent. She was a constant force, her identity rooted not in any crown a man gave her, but in the land she was born to rule. Her story sets the stage for another, even more unexpected ruler, one who would seize power not through inheritance or marriage, but through sheer, undeniable genius on the battlefield. The prison door swung open not with a key, but with a king's death. After 16 years of confinement, Eleanor of Aquitaine emerged not as a broken widow, but as the most experienced politician in Europe. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, now wore the crown, and he immediately entrusted his vast empire to the one person he knew could hold it, his 70-year-old mother. While Richard embarked on the Third Crusade, Eleanor ruled as regent, a role that demanded every ounce of her cunning. She traveled ceaselessly, from the damp castles of England to the sun-baked keeps of Aquitaine, settling disputes, collecting taxes, and reminding fractious lords of their loyalty. Her true test came with shocking news. Richard had been captured on his journey home and held for an astronomical ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor. The sum demanded was staggering, 150,000 marks, a fortune that would bankrupt the kingdom. While others panicked, Eleanor went to work. She became the kingdom's chief fundraiser and diplomat, imposing a punishing tax known as the Saladin tithe on every citizen, seizing church gold and silver, and even negotiating directly with the emperor's representatives. Her letters from this period reveal a mind of steel, pleading, bargaining, and threatening to secure her son's release. She personally escorted the final installment of the ransom across the Alps in the dead of winter, a journey of immense hardship for a woman now in her 70s. When Richard finally returned, he owed his crown and his freedom to her political mastery, but her work was never done. After Richard's death, she once again took to the roads, this time to secure the succession for her controversial youngest son, John. She traveled to Castile to fetch a bride for a French prince, forging a crucial alliance, and she personally presided over John's coronation. Her court remained a beacon of culture, a place where the legendary troubadours found patronage, weaving tales of courtly love that often mirrored the complex political realities she navigated daily. The enduring mystery of Eleanor lies in the source of her unwavering authority. How did a woman, twice a queen and imprisoned for so long, command such loyalty from a notoriously independent nobility? The answer may lie in a simple, profound truth. She was not just their queen, she was their duchess. Her power was rooted in the land of Aquitaine, a birthright no marriage or imprisonment could erase. The lords followed her because she was the legitimate, lifelong embodiment of their home. Look at her tomb effigy at Fontevraud Abbey. She is depicted not in regal repose, but reading a book, a symbol of wisdom and eternal vigilance. Was she the power behind the throne? For her husbands, she was a partner they ultimately failed to control. For her sons, she was the indispensable foundation upon which their reigns were built. She wielded a different kind of power, one of deep legitimacy, relentless diplomacy, and a political memory that spanned the entire century. Her story proves that influence, once earned, can survive a king's displeasure and a prison's walls, a lesson not lost on a very different woman waiting in the wings of history, one who would use faith as her ultimate political weapon. While Eleanor navigated the courts of France and England, another kind of power was being forged in the mountain passes of northern Italy. Matilda of Tuscany, the great countess, commanded not through the quiet diplomacy of a regent, but from the saddle of a war horse at the head of her own armies. In the 11th century, a time when women were expected to pray or obey, Matilda ruled a vast swath of land stretching from the Po River to central Italy, a territory she inherited and defended with fierce independence. Her story is inextricably linked to the greatest conflict of her age, the investiture controversy, a bitter struggle over who held the ultimate authority. the Pope in Rome or the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a war over the soul of Europe, and Matilda chose her side with unwavering conviction. She became the sword and shield of Pope Gregory VII, the radical pontiff who dared to claim the Church supremacy over all secular rulers. Her network of nearly 100 fortified castles, strung like stone beads along the Apennine Mountains, became the military backbone of the papal cause. From these impregnable fortresses, she could control the vital mountain passes, moving troops, sheltering papal allies, and blocking the advance of imperial forces. She was a logistics genius and a battlefield commander, a reality that baffled and infuriated her male contemporaries. How did a woman come to hold such raw, military power in a warrior society? Part of the answer lies in the unique nature of her inheritance and her own formidable character. She was not a queen consort. She was a ruling countess in her own right, a sovereign lord who answered to no husband, for she famously resisted all political marriages meant to absorb her lands. Her authority was personal, direct, and backed by the loyalty of her knights. This sets the stage for the most legendary moment of her life, an event that would freeze a political drama into an iconic image of medieval power. In the bitter winter of 1077, the excommunicated Emperor Henry IV, desperate to have the Pope's ban lifted and his crown secured, undertook a humiliating pilgrimage. He crossed the Alps into Italy and approached Matilda's most formidable stronghold, the castle of Canossa. For 3 days, the most powerful man in the Germanic world stood outside the gates, barefoot in the snow, wearing a hair shirt, begging for forgiveness and entry. This was not a meeting between an emperor and a pope. It was a supplicant kneeling at the gate of a papal ally, and that ally was a woman. Matilda and her mother acted as intermediaries, negotiating the terms of Henry's penance. The scene at Canossa was a masterpiece of political theater that resonated across centuries, a vivid demonstration that spiritual authority could, temporarily, humble imperial might. And at the center of it all was Matilda, the gatekeeper. The mystery that surrounds her is one of motivation. Why did she stake everything, her lands, her soldiers, her very life, on this papal cause? Some historians see pure, militant piety, a woman so devoted to church reform that she became its greatest champion. Others detect a brilliant political calculation, a recognition that supporting the Pope was the surest way to guarantee her own autonomy against the encroaching power of the Holy Roman Emperor. By making herself indispensable to Gregory VII, she secured a powerful ally who would defend her right to rule alone. The truth likely lives in the space between faith and strategy. For Matilda, the Church's independence from imperial control was the guarantor of her own independence. Her will, written near the end of her life, bequeathing all her vast estates directly to the papacy, was the final, defiant act of this alliance. It was also an act that ignited centuries of legal disputes, as later emperors and popes fought over the legitimacy of a woman's right to dispose of her own property. Matilda's legacy is carved into the landscape, in the ruins of her mountain castles, and in the enduring question of how one woman became the linchpin of an era. She proves that influence could be measured not only in words and laws, but in stone walls and loyal soldiers, a truth understood by our next figure, who would wield a very different weapon, the written word. The clash of swords at Canossa echoed across a continent, but another kind of battle for authority was unfolding in a kingdom born from blood and faith. The air in Jerusalem was thick with incense and tension, a city held by a fragile European elite surrounded by powerful neighbors. Here, a queen would fight not with armies, but with the careful balance of a crown. Melisende, daughter of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, was raised from birth to rule. In a land where every decision could mean the survival or collapse of the Crusader states, her father took the unprecedented step of naming her his sole heir. When Baldwin died in 1131, Melisende did not become a mere consort. She was crowned Queen of Jerusalem in her own right, her authority shared, yet contested, with her husband, Fulk of Anjou. Fulk arrived from Europe with his own knights and ambitions, expecting to be the true king. He began systematically replacing Melisende's Armenian and Syrian Christian advisors with his own men from Anjou, attempting to erase her political influence and rule alone. This was not just a marital dispute, it was a coup in slow motion, threatening to destabilize the entire kingdom. Melisend's response was a masterclass in political survival. She did not raise armies immediately. Instead, she cultivated a powerful faction within the nobility and, crucially, with the Latin Church. These lords and bishops remembered her father's will and saw Fulk's actions as a violation of the kingdom's laws. Their support transformed her personal grievance into a constitutional crisis. The tension erupted into a brief but decisive civil war, with castles changing hands and the kingdom teetering on the brink. The resolution was a clear victory for Melisend. Fulk was forced to reconcile, and from that moment forward, he ruled alongside her as a true partner, her name appearing alongside his on all official charters. She had defended her birthright not through sheer force, but through the deeper power of legitimacy and alliance. When Fulk died in a hunting accident in 1143, Melisend did not retreat to a nunnery. She stepped fully into her power as regent for her 13-year-old son, Baldwin III. For over a decade, she governed the kingdom of Jerusalem with a skilled hand, her name alone commanding the loyalty of the diverse and fractious nobility. She navigated treaties with the Byzantine Empire and managed the constant threat from Muslim neighbors, understanding that diplomacy was as vital as the sword in this vulnerable outpost. Even when Baldwin came of age, she refused to relinquish control, leading to another painful division of the kingdom before a final reconciliation. Her influence extended beyond the council chamber into the very soul of Jerusalem. She was a legendary patron, funding the breathtaking renovation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom. The Golden Mosaics, the new shrine, the very layout we see today owe much to her vision and wealth. She commissioned lavish illuminated manuscripts, like the stunning Melisend Psalter, a personal prayer book of exquisite beauty that served as a portable symbol of her piety and her royal status. The mystery of Melisend lies in the quiet effectiveness of her rule. In a realm defined by holy war and masculine violence, how did a woman maintain control for so long? The answer is woven into the fabric of the kingdom itself. Jerusalem was a new society, its laws and traditions still being written. Melisend embodied continuity, the direct link to its founding king. Her power was seen not as an aberration, but as a necessity for stability. She mastered the art of symbolic gesture, using patronage of the church to solidify her divine right to rule, and skillfully balanced the various ethnic and religious factions within her court to prevent any one group from overpowering her. She ruled not as a warrior queen, but as the keystone in a fragile arch, the central piece that held everything else in place. Her story shifts our gaze from the battlefields of Europe to the intricate, dangerous courts of a kingdom perched on the edge of the world, a setting where another queen would soon face an unimaginable choice between her crown and her conscience. The Golden Mosaics of Jerusalem were still new when a princess was born into a very different empire, one clinging to its past glory. In the flickering lamplight of a Constantinople palace, Anna Komnene held a history that was not yet written, her own. As the eldest daughter of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, she was raised in the purple, the porphyry chamber reserved for imperial births, and educated with a brilliance meant for an emperor. Her father saw in her a formidable mind, and for a time, it seemed the ancient Roman world might see its first ruling empress in her own right since the days of Theodora. She was groomed for power, married to a suitable noble to strengthen her claim, and stood as her father's closest confidant during military campaigns and political crises. The future was a crown waiting for her head. Then a son was born. The arrival of her brother, John, shattered Anna's political destiny. In the rigid system of male primogeniture that had reasserted itself, a daughter, no matter how brilliant, was suddenly an obstacle to the succession. When Alexios died, John II Komnenos swiftly took the throne, and Anna's world collapsed. But this princess was no passive observer of her own downfall. She became the center of a dangerous and persistent conspiracy, rallying her husband and her powerful mother, the Empress Irene, in a desperate plot to overthrow John. The scheme reached its infamous climax with an alleged attempt to poison the new emperor, a charge that may have been truth or a convenient fabrication by the victors. The plot failed, Stripped of her titles and wealth, Anna was forced into exile, not in a dungeon, but within the walls of the Ceceridomene monastery, a comfortable yet gilded cage. Here lies the central mystery of her life. Was Anna Comnene a bitter, vengeful schemer, poisoning the well of history because she was denied the throne? Or was she a genius of her age, a political visionary sidelined by the blunt instrument of patriarchal tradition, her ambitions refocused into another kind of legacy? The answer may be both, and it is written in the pages of her life's work, the Alexiad. In her monastic retirement, Anna did not fade into prayerful silence. She assembled a circle of scholars and, with meticulous detail and profound literary skill, composed a 15-volume history of her father's reign. This was no simple chronicle. The Alexiad is a masterpiece of Byzantine literature, a rich tapestry of military strategy, theological debate, and court intrigue, all framed as a heroic epic with her father as the protagonist. But read between its elegant Greek lines, and another story emerges. This is also a work of profound political propaganda and personal justification. By elevating Alexios to the status of a savior who restored the empire's greatness, Anna implicitly argued that the rightful legacy of his reign was tarnished by his successor, her brother. She subtly inserts herself into the narrative at crucial moments, advising her father, interpreting omens, showcasing her own indispensable role. The history becomes her final, unassailable court, where she judges events and defends her family's, and by extension her own, honor. The visuals of her world are stark in their contrast, the glittering gold of a manuscript page like the Alexiad itself, filled with careful script, and the somber, serene faces of icons in a monastic chapel. Was she writing history, or was she rewriting her fate? Anna Comnene used the only weapon left to her, the pen, to build a monument more enduring than any temporary rule. She secured her father's memory, and in doing so, carved out a space for her own intellect in the historical record, ensuring that while she never wore the imperial crown, she would forever hold the authority of the historian who defined an era. Her story of thwarted ambition transformed into literary immortality shows us that power could be seized not only from a throne, but from a writing desk, a lesson that echoes in the life of a woman who would turn a different kind of knowledge into political authority, a healer whose remedies would decide the fate of kings. The pen can rewrite history, but a sword can redraw a map. As Anna Comnene inscribed her father's legacy in Constantinople, a princess in the fractured kingdoms of Iberia was fighting for a crown with her own name on it. Isabella of Castile was not born to an easy inheritance. The year was 1474, and Castile was plunged into the War of the Castilian Succession, a brutal civil war. On one side stood Isabella, the half-sister of the late king. On the other stood her niece, Juana, supported by the powerful king of Portugal. This was not a simple dynastic squabble. It was a fight for the very soul and future of the largest kingdom in Spain. Isabella's claim was legally weaker, but she possessed something far more valuable, an unshakable will and a genius for political alliance. Her masterstroke was a secret marriage to Ferdinand, heir to the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. This union, forged against the wishes of the current Castilian king, was a breathtaking gamble. It bound the two most powerful Spanish crowns together, creating a partnership that would define an era. Together, they defeated Juana's forces at the Battle of Toro, a victory that secured Isabella's throne and began the slow, deliberate unification of Spain. But Isabella was never a silent partner. Their motto, Tanto Monte, Monte Tanto, Isabel como Fernando, said it all. Isabella is the same as Ferdinand. She ruled Castile in her own right, he ruled Aragon, and they governed their combined interests as absolute equals, a rare model of true co-monarchy. She presided over councils, issued laws, and even led reforms to tame Castile's rebellious nobility, personally riding out to dismantle their illegal fortresses. Her vision for a unified, powerful, and purely Christian Spain drove two of history's most consequential and controversial projects. The first was the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. For 10 grueling years, she and Ferdinand financed a war of attrition against the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula. Isabella did not stay in a distant palace. She moved her entire court to the front lines, a mobile city of tents and administrators, overseeing supply lines, morale, and strategy. In January 1492, the Alhambra Palace surrendered, and the Catholic monarchs entered Granada in triumph. The second project was born from that same fervent piety. To consolidate their new, unified realm, Isabella and Ferdinand sought religious uniformity. With papal approval, they established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, a state-controlled tribunal aimed at rooting out heresy, particularly among Jewish and Muslim converts suspected of practicing their old faith in secret. The mystery that haunts Isabella's legacy is the chasm between her sincere, devout personal faith and the ruthless state policy it inspired. How could the queen who founded hospitals, reformed clergy, and championed education also sanction an institution known for its secrecy and severity? The answer lies in a medieval mindset colliding with the birth of the modern state. For Isabella, a unified faith was not just a spiritual ideal, it was the essential glue for a strong kingdom. Her piety convinced her that purifying the nation was an act of mercy, saving souls from error and protecting the realm from internal division. This conviction led to the Alhambra Decree of 1492, which ordered the expulsion of all Jews from Spain, a tragic and devastating act of intolerance that followed the fall of Granada. That same year, her vision turned outward, sponsoring the voyage of an obscure Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus, an investment that would unknowingly open a new world to European domination. Portraits of Isabella show a severe, pale-faced woman in rich gowns, her gaze direct and unwavering. They capture the essence of a ruler whose deep personal beliefs became the blueprint for an empire, a queen who forged a nation through war, faith, and an iron will, leaving a legacy as monumental and contested as the great cathedral she would order built over Granada's main mosque. Her story of unification through force raises a profound question. What happens when the drive to consolidate power turns inward, targeting the very people it should protect? This dark thread leads us to another court, where a different kind of queen would use not force, but profound cultural influence to secure her place in history. Isabella's sword forged a nation, but a pen in Paris was building a different kind of kingdom, one made of words and ideas. In the bustling scriptoriums and candlelit chambers of the French court, Christine de Pizan, a widow with 3 children to support, did something extraordinary. She became the first professional woman writer in Europe. Born in Venice but raised in the court of King Charles V of France, Christine was educated by her father, the royal astrologer, a rare gift for a girl. This education became her lifeline when her husband died suddenly, leaving her in debt and responsible for her family. In a world that offered women few respectable ways to earn money, Christine turned her grief and her learning into a career. She began writing love poetry, but soon her focus sharpened into a powerful, defiant mission. She took up her pen to fight a literary war. The battlefield was the widespread, deeply ingrained misogyny of medieval literature, epitomized by the wildly popular Romance of the Rose, a poem that depicted women as fickle, vain, and deceitful. Christine entered a famous literary debate, now called the Quarrel of the Romance of the Rose, writing letters that systematically attacked the poem's portrayal of women. For the first time, a woman's voice was publicly and eloquently challenging the very books that taught society to scorn her. This was not just literary criticism, it was a political act, asserting that women deserved a say in how they were defined. Christine's genius was to channel this defense into practical, influential works. She understood that to secure her place and advocate for women, she needed the patronage of the powerful. She became a political writer, producing advice manuals for princes and a highly flattering biography of the late King Charles V, works that established her as a serious intellectual at court. These were savvy moves, proving her usefulness and wisdom in the traditional realms of male power. Yet her most lasting work sprang from a moment of personal despair. One day, reading yet another philosopher's diatribe against women, she fell into a deep sadness, wondering why so many learned men hated her sex. From this low point, an allegorical vision was born. In her masterpiece, The Book of the City of Ladies, Christine is visited by 3 radiant figures: reason, rectitude, and justice. They command her to construct a metaphorical city, built not with stone, but with the stories of great and virtuous women from history and myth. From queens and warriors to inventors and scholars, she populates this city with hundreds of examples, creating an unassailable fortress of female achievement. This was her ultimate political treatise. By compiling this legacy, she argued for women's inherent capability and their right to education. The city was a refuge from slander and a blueprint for a better society. Visualize the stunning illustrations from her manuscripts, showing Christine at her desk, receiving wisdom from the allegorical ladies, or directing the construction of her symbolic city's walls, each stone a woman's story. The mystery of Christine's life is one of quiet, relentless revolution. How did a widow, with no protector and no formal position, manage to become the voice of a court and a gender? She wielded the only tools she had, her intellect, her elegant prose, and an impeccable sense of timing. She wrote what patrons wanted to hear, while subtly weaving in her radical defense of women. She turned her personal struggle into a universal argument. Her city of ladies was not a call for rebellion in the streets, but for a revolution in thought, insisting that if women were educated, they would prove themselves the equals of men in virtue and intellect. In a final, poignant act of foresight, as civil war erupted in France, she retired to a convent, but not before writing a militant poem honoring Joan of Arc, celebrating the young woman who was doing with a sword what Christine had done with a pen, defending a kingdom. Christine de Pizan proves that political influence does not always require a crown or an army. Sometimes it is built word by word, book by book, in the silent, persistent act of changing minds. Her legacy invites us to look beyond the throne room to the study, where another kind of power was being cultivated, not over lands, but over the human heart and its beliefs. Christine de Pizan's pen defended a kingdom of ideas, but another Joan would defend a kingdom of steel and blood, though history often forgets her name. Joan of Navarre was a queen whose life was a chessboard, and she was determined to be the player, not the pawn. Born in the late 13th century, she inherited the small but strategically vital Pyrenean kingdom of Navarre as an infant, becoming its sovereign queen. Her crown immediately made her a piece in the grand game between Europe's superpowers, France and England. To secure a powerful ally, her guardians arranged a marriage to Philip IV of France, a man known as Philip the Fair. This union was a masterstroke of French policy, effectively bringing Navarre into the French sphere of influence and giving Philip a royal title in his own right. For Joan, it was a transfer of power, from an independent queen to a queen consort in a much larger, more dangerous court. As Queen of France, Joan's primary duty was to produce heirs, and she fulfilled this with monumental consequence. She gave birth to 3 sons who would all wear the French crown: Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. In an age of high infant mortality, her success in securing the direct Capetian line should have made her one of the most revered women in Europe. Yet, her story twists into shadow after King Philip's death. During the turbulent reigns of her sons, a sudden and shocking accusation emerged from the chronicles. Queen Joan was arrested and imprisoned for over a year, charged with adultery and, most sensationally, of using witchcraft and poison to murder her late husband. The imagery is stark: a dowager queen, mother of kings, dragged from her chambers and held in fortress rooms, while whispers of dark arts and infidelity swirled through the court. The mystery here is thick and politically charged. Were these charges based on truth, or were they a brutal fabrication? Historians see the latter. The evidence was flimsy and the trial suspicious. Joan's real crime was likely her power and her wealth. As the former sovereign of Navarre and a wealthy dowager, she controlled vast lands and resources. By disgracing and imprisoning her, powerful factions at the French court, possibly including her own son King Louis X, could seize her assets and neutralize her influence. It was a cold, calculated move. After over a year, the charges were quietly dropped, and Joan was released, her reputation forever tarnished but her life spared. She spent her final years in her dower lands, living quietly until her death. Her legacy, however, extends far beyond the scandal. The rapid succession of her 3 sons, each dying without a surviving male heir, triggered a monumental crisis. The direct Capetian line was extinct. This vacuum led to the claim of Philip of Valois, a cousin, becoming King Philip VI. But across the Channel, King Edward III of England, who was also a grandson of Philip the Fair through his mother, pressed his own claim. This bitter dispute over the French succession was the direct spark that ignited the Hundred Years' War. Joan of Navarre, through her very bloodline, was the matriarch of that catastrophic conflict. Her story is a perfect encapsulation of medieval women's political reality, to be used as a bridge between kingdoms, praised as a mother of kings, and then sacrificed as a convenient villain when power shifted. She reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman could be was not an enemy, but an inconvenient heiress. A crown can rest on a head without ever being worn. In the cold, pine-scented courts of late 14th century Scandinavia, a woman achieved what generations of kings had failed to do. She permanently united three fractious kingdoms under a single rule. Margaret, daughter of the King of Denmark, was married at 10 to the King of Norway, a political alliance meant to secure peace, but fate handed her a far greater destiny. When her father died without a male heir, the Danish nobles, facing chaos and foreign threat, did something astonishing. They offered the throne not to her infant son, but to Margaret herself. They named her regent, but in truth, they were placing the kingdom in her hands. She accepted with a steely resolve that would define the next 3 decades. Her first task was to secure Norway for her young son, Olaf, and when her husband died, she became regent there as well. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed her legacy was secure through him, but then Olaf died suddenly at 17. In an instant, the dynastic thread was cut. Most women in her position would have been pushed aside, their political purpose extinguished. Margaret did the opposite. She used the profound grief and loyalty Olaf had inspired to cement her own power. The nobles of both Denmark and Norway, fearing a vacuum, confirmed her not as a queen mother in mourning, but as their rightful ruler, their sovereign lady and master. This title was her masterpiece of political branding. She was no queen consort, a wife defined by a husband. She was the sovereign, the master, the unmistakable source of authority. Her great work was just beginning. To the east, Sweden was in turmoil, its nobility locked in conflict with their German king. Margaret saw her chance. She skillfully intervened, positioning herself as the alternative to disorder, and the Swedish council deposed their king and invited her to rule. Now holding all 3 crowns, Margaret orchestrated her crowning achievement. In 1397, at the Swedish fortress of Kalmar, she brought the councils of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden together. There, she presented her grandnephew, Eric of Pomerania, as the future king. The Union of Kalmar was proclaimed, a single kingdom united forever under one monarch, but everyone in that hall knew who the real architect was. Eric was a child, and Margaret, the sovereign lady, would rule as regent for the rest of her life. Her rule was pragmatic and fiercely centralized. She reclaimed royal lands that had been lost to the nobility, filled her councils with loyal commoners rather than arrogant aristocrats, and built a formidable treasury. Managing the rebellious Swedish nobility, who chafed under Danish influence, required constant vigilance and clever diplomacy. She would appoint loyal bailiffs, grant strategic privileges to towns to counterbalance noble power, and never hesitated to use military force when persuasion failed. Her personal life remains a locked room in history. She was widowed young, never remarried, and left no intimate letters or diaries. All her energy, all her emotion, seems to have been poured into the state. Was her drive for union a visionary dream of Nordic power to stand against German Hanseatic traders and other European kingdoms? Or was it simply the expression of a brilliant political mind that could not tolerate fragmentation? The mystery of Margaret is the mystery of the Union itself. She created an entity that would last, in some form, for over a century, yet her methods planted the seeds of its eventual dissolution. By ruling as an absolutist before the term existed, by centralizing power so completely in her own hands, she fostered deep resentments, particularly in Sweden, that would later erupt. Portraits show her with a severe, composed face, her head wrapped in the elaborate horned headdress of the era, a symbol of authority as unmistakable as any crown. She built a legacy of stone and law, not of personal legend. The Calmer Union stands as her monument, a testament to what a ruler called only a lady could achieve through sheer political will, proving that the greatest power sometimes lies in the title you choose for yourself, and in the loyalties you command from those who never expected to follow you. A child's hands are too small for a scepter, but history had a different plan for Jadwiga of Poland. In 1384, a girl of just 10 years was crowned not as queen, but as King of Poland. This was no poetic title, it was a legal necessity, a way to assert her sovereign authority in a kingdom that desperately needed a ruler. Jadwiga was the last surviving member of the Polish branch of the Capetian House of Anjou, and her small shoulders carried the fate of a nation. Raised in the sophisticated court of Hungary, she was deeply pious, fluent in several languages, and already wise beyond her years. Yet her personal dreams were about to be overruled by a staggering geopolitical opportunity. She had been promised in marriage to William of Austria, a match she may have desired, but when she arrived in Poland, the nobles presented her with a different future. They urged her to marry Jagiella, the pagan Grand Duke of Lithuania, a man decades older than her. This was the ultimate political calculation. A union with Lithuania would neutralize a dangerous enemy and create the largest territorial bloc in all of Europe, a colossal state stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It would also bring about the Christianization of the last pagan realm on the continent. The choice was a brutal one, a dynastic duty versus a young girl's heart. The chronicles tell a dramatic tale of Jadwiga attempting to flee the wall castle with an axe to break down a gate to reach William, only to be persuaded by a bishop to accept her destiny. Whether this story is literal truth or powerful allegory, it captures the profound personal sacrifice at the core of her reign. She agreed. In 1385, she married Jagiella, who was baptized, taking the name W. Ladislaw Jagiello, and became King of Poland alongside her. The Union of Creua was signed, binding the two nations in an alliance that would endure for 4 centuries. Jadwiga was far more than a political pawn in this grand design. She was an active co-ruler and a cultural force. Fluent in Latin, she corresponded with popes and intellectuals. She used her vast wealth and influence to champion education and the arts, most famously restoring and expanding the Krakow Academy, which later became the Jagiellonian University, one of the oldest in the world. Her royal seals show her not in a submissive pose, but enthroned and holding an orb and scepter, symbols of her kingly power. She traveled extensively through her realm, settling disputes, founding churches, and acting as a diplomat. Her deep piety drove her to fund hospitals and champion religious causes, but it was always paired with a sharp political mind. The mystery that lingers around Jadwiga is the nature of her partnership with Jagiello. Was she a saintly figure gently guiding her converted husband, or was she a shrewd strategist, using her spiritual authority to solidify a political union? Her early death in childbirth at just 25 cut short a reign of immense promise, plunging Poland into mourning. She was buried in the Wall Cathedral, and almost immediately, tales of her miracles began. The people venerated her as a saint long before the Church officially made it so in 1997. Jadwiga's legacy is etched in stone and spirit, the vast map of a European superpower and the quiet halls of a university. She proved that authority could be wielded with grace, that a crown could be borne with both piety and profound political intelligence, and that the greatest unions are sometimes forged not by conquest, but by a conscious, costly choice. Her crown brought not just a title, but a bridge. Anne of Bohemia arrived in England in 1382, a 14-year-old princess from the glittering court of Prague, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, one of Europe's most learned rulers. Her marriage to the 15-year-old King Richard II was a financial scandal. Her dowry was never fully paid, and the English Parliament grumbled about getting nothing but a penniless queen. Yet Anne would repay her adopted country with a currency far more valuable than gold. She brought peace. In a realm seething with social tension and baronial strife, the young queen carved out a unique role as a mediator and intercessor. She became known as the Good Queen, a title earned not through birthright, but through consistent, gentle diplomacy. Her most famous act came during the explosive Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which actually occurred the year before her arrival. a detail often blurred by legend. The more accurate testament to her reputation is how she repeatedly used her influence to soften her husband's often impulsive and vengeful nature. When the city of London fell out of royal favor, it was Anne who knelt before Richard, pleading for mercy until he granted it. She made intercession, the act of pleading for others, into a powerful political tool, calming the king's anger and fostering reconciliation. This was smart statecraft. By positioning herself as the merciful counterbalance to royal wrath, she helped stabilize a volatile reign and built immense popular goodwill. Her influence extended from politics into the very fabric of English culture. Anne and her Bohemian attendants introduced new elegance to the court, the elaborate horned headdresses and flowing gowns seen in manuscripts of the era. She is also widely credited with popularizing the side saddle in England, a device that allowed noblewomen to ride with greater decorum and safety, fundamentally changing their mobility and public presence. But the most intriguing mystery of her life is the nature of her marriage. Unlike most royal unions of convenience, chroniclers of the time insist Richard and Anne developed a deep, genuine affection. They were constant companions from adolescence into adulthood, and the king was famously devoted to her. This personal bond likely amplified her political influence, as her counsel came from a place of trusted intimacy. Her sudden death from plague in 1394 shattered this balance. Richard's grief was catastrophic and very public. He ordered the royal manor where she died, Sheen Palace, to be torn down in his anguish. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, paranoid, and autocratic in the years that followed, leading many historians to see her death as the pivotal moment that unraveled his capacity for reasoned rule. Without Anne's calming intercessions, his tyrannical tendencies went unchecked, culminating in his deposition and murder. The visual legacy of their relationship is hauntingly captured in the Wilton diptych, a portable altarpiece made for Richard's private devotion. In it, a youthful, serene Richard is presented to the Virgin and Child by his patron saints, and on the opposite panel, standing among the heavenly host, is a figure often believed to be Anne of Bohemia, forever watching over him. Was her good queen image merely a performance of expected feminine virtue, or was it a brilliantly deployed form of political capital? In a monarchy where the king's will was law, the power to persuade him, to redirect his anger into mercy, was a profound and subtle authority. Anne mastered this art, proving that a queen's softest word could sometimes carry the weight of a crown. Her gentle intercession in England stood in stark contrast to the battlefield pressures her husband would soon face. Across the Channel, another queen was proving that mercy and statecraft could be two sides of the same coin. Philippa of Hainault, the wife of the formidable King Edward III, arrived in England as a teenager, a marriage arranged to secure a vital alliance with her wealthy, strategically located county in the Low Countries. This was a partnership built on both affection and political necessity. Edward valued her deeply, and she would become one of the most beloved and effective queens in English history. Her defining moment is etched into legend and stone. In 1347, after a grueling 11-month siege, the vital French port of Calais surrendered to Edward. Furious at the prolonged resistance and desperate to make an example, the king vowed to execute 6 of the town's leading citizens, the burghers, who came to him with ropes around their necks, offering their lives to spare their fellow townspeople. The court was silent, the soldiers tense. It was Queen Philippa, heavily pregnant with their daughter Margaret, who threw herself on her knees before Edward. Weeping, she pleaded for him to show mercy for the sake of their unborn child and his own honor. Moved by her passionate appeal, Edward relented and spared the burghers. This was not a spontaneous act of soft-heartedness, it was a masterstroke of political theater. Philippa's public intercession allowed the vengeful king to appear magnanimous without losing face, transforming a brutal act of reprisal into a chivalric legend of royal mercy that bolstered Edward's reputation across Europe. Her role was far broader than crisis diplomacy. With Edward campaigning for years in France during the opening phases of the Hundred Years' War, Philippa served as regent, governing the realm in his stead. She managed the kingdom's finances, mustered troops and supplies for the war effort, and even presided over parliament. Her deep connections to the Low Countries were invaluable. helping to maintain the complex web of alliances that kept money and mercenaries flowing to the English cause. She was a patron of scholars and a founder of Queen's College, Oxford, ensuring her legacy in education. Yet, the later years of this powerful partnership are shrouded in a poignant mystery. As Philippa's health declined, a shadow fell across the court in the form of Alice Pers, a lady-in-waiting who became Edward's mistress and, according to chroniclers, wielded enormous and corrupt influence over the aging king. The question lingers, did Philippa lose her political sway to this ambitious woman, or was she simply too ill to maintain her former role? The truth is likely a painful mix. Chroniclers, fond of the good queen, paint Alice as a greedy villain, but her rise also signals a court where Philippa's stabilizing presence was fading. Philippa's greatest political legacy, however, walked on two legs. She bore Edward 13 children, an astonishing number for the time, and she raised them to be pieces on the European chessboard. Her eldest son was Edward, the Black Prince, the legendary warrior who won the Battle of Poitiers. Another son, John of Gaunt, became the wealthiest and most powerful magnate in England, his line eventually producing the Tudor dynasty. Her daughters were married into the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and the Low Countries, weaving a net of English influence across the continent. Her effigy in Westminster Abbey shows her not in the stiff repose of earlier monuments, but with a gentle, almost smiling face, her hands resting peacefully. It is the image of a beloved queen, a capable ruler, and a mother of dynasties, a woman whose compassion at Calais secured a city and whose management at home secured a kingdom, even as the final moves of her own life's game slipped quietly from her hands. The ramparts of the Ravaldino fortress were slick with rain and defiance. In 1488, with her husband murdered and her children held hostage by conspirators, Caterina Sforza faced a mob from the battlements. They threatened to kill her sons if she did not surrender the citadel. Her response became the stuff of dark legend. She reportedly lifted her skirts, gestured to her body, and shouted that she had the mold to make more children. This was not a moment of madness, but a calculated act of political theater, a brutal declaration that her bloodline and her rule were not so easily broken. She would retake her city and execute the conspirators with a methodical ferocity that cemented her name, the Tiger of Forli. As the Countess of Forli and Imola, Caterina was a product of Renaissance Italy's most ruthless school, the Sforza dynasty of Milan. She was trained from childhood in statecraft, finance, and the grim realities of power. When she was widowed, she did not retreat. She seized control as regent for her young son, Ottaviano, and then ruled in her own right long after he came of age. Her authority was military, personal, and absolute. She wore armor, drilled her soldiers personally, and designed fortifications, understanding that in the snake pit of Italian politics, survival depended on the strength of your walls and the loyalty of your troops. Yet Caterina's mind was not confined to the battlefield. Behind the stone walls of her private chambers, she was a dedicated alchemist, maintaining a sophisticated laboratory. Here, she sought not just to transmute metals, but to distill the very essence of power, medicines, poisons, and cosmetics, blurring the line between science, magic, and statecraft. Her recipes, carefully recorded, reveal a ruler obsessed with control over nature, health, and perception itself. This duality captures her mystery. Was she a savage tyrant or a brilliant, multifaceted ruler, trapped in an era of perpetual war? Her political machinations were a dizzying dance of betrayal and alliance. To secure her small state, she navigated between the colossal powers of the age, the King of France, the Holy Roman Emperor, and a succession of scheming popes. She married 3 times, each union a strategic play, and she famously outmaneuvered her second husband by having him assassinated when he became a threat to her children's inheritance. Her correspondence, thousands of letters that survive, is a historical treasure trove. They show her negotiating loans, commissioning artworks, advising relatives on governance, and issuing crisp, uncompromising orders to her castellans. In these letters, we see not a monster, but a consummate administrator, a mother fiercely protecting her family's interests, and a patron of the arts who understood the propaganda value of beauty. Her eventual downfall came from the one force more ruthless than herself, Cesare Borgia. In 1500, as Borgia carved a kingdom from the Italian Romagna with papal backing, Caterina's fortresses fell one by one under a relentless siege. Even her famed defiance had its limits against overwhelming force and modern artillery. She was captured, imprisoned, and reportedly suffered attempted poisoning, before being released to a quiet retirement. Her legacy is as complex as the era she embodied. Portraits show a severe, handsome woman with a steady gaze, sometimes depicted in armor, a symbol of her martial spirit. She ruled with an iron fist because the alternative was annihilation, a reality for every minor lord in the fractured landscape of Renaissance Italy. Her story forces us to ask whether ruthlessness was a choice or a prerequisite for a woman holding power in a world of wolves. As the Tiger of Forli faded into history, another queen was learning that the greatest battles are often fought not with cannon, but with cunning and cultural prestige, in a court where every smile could be a dagger. While Caterina Sforza fortified her castles, a very different kind of battle was being waged through bloodlines and legal documents in England. The Wars of the Roses were a chaotic, bloody scramble for the crown, a dynastic free-for-all where noble families rose and fell with terrifying speed. In this vortex of ambition and violence, one woman played a longer, quieter, and ultimately more successful game than any armored lord. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and she was not a queen, but a kingmaker. Her entire life was a single, unwavering mission to see her son, Henry Tudor, on the throne of England. This was a seemingly impossible dream. Henry was a penniless exile with a tenuous claim, descended from a line that had been explicitly barred from succession. Margaret, however, possessed a formidable combination of deep piety, political genius, and sheer, unbreakable will. She was married 4 times, each union a calculated move on the political chessboard, orchestrated to protect her son's interests and advance his cause. While her husbands fought and died, Margaret built something more durable than an army. She constructed an intelligence network. From her estates, she maintained a secret correspondence with allies across England and in the courts of Europe, her letters carried by trusted priests and servants. She raised funds, pledging her own vast lands as collateral to finance the invasion that would become her son's destiny. Her most daring act was navigating the court of the Yorkist king, Richard III, even as she was secretly plotting his overthrow. She managed to convince Richard that she was loyal, all while negotiating the marriage alliance that would unite her son with the Yorkist princess, Elizabeth of York, a move designed to unite the warring Red and White Roses. The culmination of her decades of work was the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. While Henry fought, Margaret waited, her fate hanging on the outcome. When news arrived of Richard's death and Henry's victory, her life's purpose was fulfilled. But what happens to a kingmaker once the king is crowned? The mystery of Margaret's later life lies in her unique title. In official documents, she began signing herself as Margaret R. That R could stand for Richmond, her county title, but many historians believe it was a deliberate echo of the royal regina, or queen. She arranged her household with regal splendor, often dressed in robes nearly identical to the queen's, and walked only half a pace behind her daughter-in-law in processions. Was this a mother unable to relinquish control, or a partner who felt she had earned a share of the sovereignty? Her relationship with Henry VII was famously close, yet carefully managed. He trusted her implicitly, but he was also a cautious king who centralized power. Margaret navigated this by becoming his most trusted advisor in matters of state and finance, while publicly channeling her influence into piety and patronage. She became a monumental benefactor, founding Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge, and leaving detailed instructions in her will for sermons, prayers, and charities. Her portrait shows a woman in severe widow's black, her face framed by a nun-like wimple, her eyes downcast in prayer, her hands holding a prayer book. But look closer, the book is open, she is literate and learned, and the richness of the fabric speaks of immense wealth and status. She is the picture of devout humility, yet every detail proclaims her power. Margaret Beaufort proves that the throne is not always taken by the sword. Sometimes it is built patiently, piece by piece, by a mother's relentless hand. Blackmail was her weapon, and a wedding was her stage. Isabella of France arrived in England in 1308, a 12-year-old bride known as the She-Wolf, though that name would come later. She was married to King Edward II, a man whose reign was a masterclass in incompetence and favoritism. Edward lavished titles, lands, and power on his controversial favorite, Piers Gaveston, and later on the Despencer family, ignoring his queen and alienating the powerful barons. Isabella endured years of public humiliation and financial neglect, her household funds cut, her French attendants dismissed. She was a prisoner in her own court, a diplomatic pawn whose value plummeted as relations between England and her native France soured. Yet within this powerless queen simmered a formidable political mind. Her opportunity came in 1325, when Edward, desperate to settle a war with her brother, the King of France, sent Isabella to negotiate a peace. It was a fatal mistake. In Paris, free from her husband's control, Isabella transformed. She took a lover, the exiled marcher Lord Roger Mortimer, and with him forged a daring plan. They would not make peace, they would make war. Isabella became the general of her own cause. Dressed in mourning black to highlight her wrongs as a betrayed wife, she toured the courts of Europe, securing funds and soldiers. In September 1326, with a small mercenary army and Mortimer at her side, she landed in Suffolk. This was not a foreign invasion, it was a calculated public relations campaign. Isabella declared she had come to free the realm from the tyranny of the Despensers and to reclaim her rightful place as a wronged queen and mother. The country, sick of Edward's misrule, rallied to her. King Edward and his favorite Hugh Despenser the Younger fled, but were captured. What followed sealed Isabella's infamous reputation. After a mock trial, Despenser was brutally executed. Then, King Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. But a deposed king is a perpetual threat. In September 1327, the news broke from Berkeley Castle: Edward was dead. The official story was natural causes, but a horrific rumor spread like wildfire that he had been killed with a red-hot poker, a method meant to leave no outward mark but symbolizing the sin of sodomy. This gruesome tale, likely propaganda, attached itself forever to Isabella's name. The dark, central mystery is this: did she order the murder? The evidence is circumstantial but damning. She and Mortimer now ruled as regents for the young king, and a living Edward II was an endless risk to their power. Whether she gave the direct command or simply created the conditions where it was inevitable, the shadow of regicide clung to her. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer governed England, but their rule grew increasingly arrogant and corrupt. They enriched themselves shamelessly, ignoring the very magnates who had supported their coup. The final act began when the young Edward III turned 18. Chafing under his mother and her lover's control, he orchestrated his own coup. In 1330, he had Mortimer seized during a council meeting at Nottingham Castle, dragged from Isabella's very chambers. Roger Mortimer was swiftly tried and executed for treason. Edward then dealt with his mother. He did not execute her, but he ended her political life. Isabella was placed under comfortable but firm house arrest for over 2 decades, allowed estates and income but no influence. She spent her final years in pious retirement, a far cry from the woman who had led an army. Her legacy is a paradox, a tangle of victim and villain. Was she a desperate woman using the only tools available to escape a miserable marriage and a catastrophic king? Or was she an ambitious, ruthless operator who deposed a monarch and likely arranged his murder? Portraits are scarce, but the image from film, like her depiction in Braveheart, however historically loose, captures the enduring archetype, the beautiful, vengeful queen in elegant gowns, a figure of cold calculation. The real Isabella was both a product of her brutal circumstances and a shaper of them, a queen who discovered that to save a kingdom, she might have to destroy a king, a lesson that cost her everything she fought to gain. The she-wolf's shadow still loomed when a new foreign queen arrived to rule France. Blanche of Castile was just 12 years old when she married Prince Louis of France, a political match to seal a treaty between 2 rival kingdoms. She was born into the formidable lineage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, raised in the sophisticated court of Castile. and she brought with her a steel will that would define an era. When her husband became King Louis VIII, his reign was tragically brief, and upon his death in 1226, the crown passed to their 12-year-old son, Louis IX. The French barons, smelling weakness and resentful of a Spanish-born regent, saw their chance to reclaim power. They did not expect the mother they intended to sideline. Blanche stood before the court and declared herself regent, her authority absolute. The kingdom braced for chaos, but chaos never arrived. Instead, they found themselves facing a political mastermind. Blanche moved with breathtaking speed and decisiveness. When a coalition of powerful nobles, led by the Count of Brittany, rose in rebellion, she did not plead or negotiate from a position of fear. She raised an army, marched it into the field herself, and crushed the revolt with military precision. She understood that to rule, she must first demonstrate an unbreakable will. But force was only one of her tools. She was a brilliant diplomat, skillfully negotiating with the King of England and the Count of Toulouse to secure advantageous treaties that expanded French territory and brought lasting peace. She reformed the royal administration, filled her council with loyal, capable men rather than just high-born aristocrats, and managed the kingdom's finances with such shrewdness that she left the treasury full. All the while, she faced the constant whisper campaign, the otherness of being La Reine étrangère, the foreign queen. They criticized her accent, her customs, and her unwavering grip on power. Yet, her very foreignness may have been her strength. Free from the tangled web of loyalties that bound French-born nobles, she could act with a clear-eyed ruthlessness for the good of the state, which, to her, was synonymous with her son. Her deep, militant piety was the engine of her rule. She raised Louis to be a paragon of Christian kingship, instilling in him a sense of divine duty that would earn him sainthood. Their relationship was the cornerstone of her policy, a partnership of profound trust. When Louis came of age, she gracefully stepped back, but her guidance never ceased. Then, in 1248, when the now King Louis IX embarked on his fateful crusade to Egypt, he did the only thing that made sense. He left the kingdom once more in the hands of his mother. Blanche, now in her 60s, resumed the regency without hesitation, governing for 6 years with the same formidable skill, quelling new unrest and holding the realm steady until news of the king's catastrophic defeat and capture reached her shores. She immediately set to work raising the enormous ransom, a final, monumental act of statecraft to save her son. The visual legacy of her regency is etched in stone and light in the great Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Reims, whose construction she fervently supported. In the beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the period, she is often depicted with her son, her hand on his shoulder, both crowned, a powerful image of tutelage and shared sovereignty. The mystery of Blanche is not one of hidden scandal, but of sheer, sustained effectiveness. How did a woman, a foreigner, wield such unchallenged power in a fiercely patriarchal society for so long? The answer lies in a perfect alignment of personal capability and perceived necessity. She made herself utterly indispensable. The barons may have hated taking orders from a woman, but they could not deny the stability, prosperity, and military success she delivered. She channeled every criticism into a demonstration of strength, and in doing so, she forged the golden age of Capetian France, crafting the stable, powerful kingdom that her saintly son would later rule. Her story proves that the most potent authority sometimes comes not from the crown you wear, but from the kingdom you build and protect with your own hands. The mountains of the Caucasus were not just a barrier, but a throne. In the late 12th century, a kingdom perched between the Black Sea and the Persian empires crowned a ruler who would defy every expectation, Tamar, who was proclaimed not queen, but king of Georgia. This was a deliberate title, a declaration of sovereign power that no husband could usurp. She inherited a realm already strengthened by her father, but Tamar would transform it into a regional superpower and a beacon of culture. Her first challenge was immediate and domestic, the powerful nobility, a class of warrior princes accustomed to bending kings to their will. At her initial coronation, they forced her to accept a husband of their choosing, a Russian prince named Yuri Bogolyubsky. It was a test of her authority before her reign had even begun. Tamar, however, was playing a longer game. She tolerated the disastrous marriage just long enough to consolidate her own base of support, and then, with the backing of a loyal faction and the Georgian Church, she did the unthinkable. She divorced her husband, had him expelled from the kingdom, and defeated the armies he later raised to try and reclaim his position. This was her first, stunning demonstration of political will. Her second marriage was her own strategic choice, to the Allan Prince David Soslan, a loyal military commander who fathered her heirs but never challenged her sole authority. With her rule secure, Tamar unleashed a golden age. Her generals led campaigns in every direction, extending Georgian influence across the Caucasus, creating an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the Caspian and challenging the Seljuk Turks. The wealth from these conquests funded a cultural renaissance. She presided over the construction of breathtaking monasteries like Vardzia, a vast cave city carved into the rock face, and Gelati, a center of learning hailed as a new Athens. Her court patronized poets, philosophers, and theologians, weaving Christian faith with a deep appreciation for Georgian language and history. It was under her patronage that the national epic, The Knight in the Panther's Skin, was composed by Shodor Rustaveli. This poem of chivalry, romance, and philosophical depth is often seen as a mirror to Tamar's own ideal of kingship, celebrating wisdom, justice, and strength. The mystery of Tamar is how she navigated the paradox of her position. How did a woman command the absolute loyalty of a fiercely patriarchal warrior nobility and a powerful Orthodox clergy? She mastered the art of symbolic partnership. She worked closely with the church, granting it lands and authority, which in turn sanctified her rule as divinely ordained. She rewarded loyal nobles with spoils from her military campaigns, tying their fortunes directly to her success. She presented herself as both a merciful mother to her people and an invincible king to her enemies, a duality captured in her icons, which show her holding a cross and a sword. The greatest enigma, however, lies in her final resting place. Despite her monumental legacy, the location of Tamar's tomb is lost to history. Legend says she was buried in secret at the Gelati Monastery to protect her remains from invaders, but no grave has ever been confirmed. This absence only magnifies her legend, allowing her to live on not in a tomb, but in the soul of the nation. She became Saint Tamar, a ruler so revered that for centuries, Georgian soldiers would go into battle with her name on their lips. She proved that the highest authority could wear a woman's face, so long as it also wore the unwavering resolve of a king. Her crown was a battlefield from the very first day. Urraca of Leon inherited a fractured realm in 1109, becoming the first reigning queen in the history of Leon, Castile, and Galicia. Her father, the formidable Alfonso VI, left her an impossible legacy, a collection of Christian kingdoms locked in the grinding Reconquista against Muslim Taifas to the south, and a nobility that viewed a woman's rule as a temporary aberration. To secure her throne and present a united front, her advisors arranged a marriage of pure political calculation to King Alfonso I of Aragon, a warrior known as the Battler. It was a catastrophic mistake. Instead of an alliance, the marriage ignited a decade-long civil war. The two Alfonsos, husband and wife, turned their armies against each other in a brutal struggle for control of Urraca's lands. The queen found herself trapped between her husband, who sought to absorb her kingdoms, and her own rebellious nobles, who used the conflict to expand their own power. She was fighting a war on every front, against her spouse, her vassals, and even the powerful Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, who excommunicated her at one point for her political maneuvers. The maps of Iberia from this period show a dizzying patchwork of tiny kingdoms and shifting borders, and Urraca's life was spent trying to hold her piece of it together while her husband and son tried to carve it apart. Her relationship with her son from her first marriage, the future Alfonso VII, added another layer of tension as he grew older and began to assert his own claim to power, often aligning with factions against her. The chroniclers of her time, all men of the church, left a damning portrait. They painted Queen Urraca as emotionally volatile, politically foolish, and morally suspect, blaming her temperament for the constant strife. But to read these accounts at face value is to miss the deeper truth. The mystery of Araka is not one of personal failure, but of systemic resistance. How could any ruler, man or woman, have maintained peace in such a volatile inheritance, married to a rival king whose very ambition was to dispossess her? Modern historians see a different figure in the fragmented records, a woman exercising relentless, gritty statecraft just to survive. Every decision was contested, every alliance fragile. When she negotiated with the church, she was devious. When she fought her husband, she was unwomanly. When she compromised, she was weak. Her reign was a relentless test of the very idea of female authority in a society defined by holy war and martial virtue. She ultimately outlasted her husband, the battler, and managed to pass a still intact, though weary, kingdom to her son. Her story is not one of glorious triumph like Tamar's, but of dogged endurance. It asks us a difficult question: when the structures of power are designed to make you fail, is survival itself a form of victory? Her legacy was not forged in a palace, but in a village garden. Joan of Arc was a peasant girl who could neither read nor write, yet her voice would command kings and alter the destiny of a nation. In the bitter winter of 1429, France was on the brink of collapse. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for decades. English troops occupied much of the north, and the French Dauphin, Charles, was uncrowned and paralyzed by doubt, his very legitimacy questioned. Into this despair stepped a 17-year-old from Domremy, claiming she had been sent by God. She said saints had spoken to her in her father's garden, voices that commanded her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. This was an outrageous claim, yet it was her only credential. Gaining an audience with Charles was her first impossible task. She traveled to his court at Chinon, and after rigorous questioning by theologians, she was granted a meeting. The legend says she immediately picked Charles out from a crowd of courtiers, though he was disguised, and whispered to him a secret that convinced him of her divine mission. That secret remains one of history's great mysteries. Some believe she confirmed a private prayer he had made. Others think she validated his legitimacy, a deep psychological need for a man whose own mother had called him a bastard. Whatever passed between them, Charles gave her a suit of white armor, a banner, and placed her with a relief army headed for the besieged city of Orléans. Orléans was the key to the Loire Valley, and its fall would mean the end of French resistance. Joan arrived not as a trained soldier, but as a moral catalyst. She infused the demoralized French troops with a fervent belief in their cause, insisting they confess their sins and fight with purity of heart. Her military advice was startlingly practical, often contradicting the cautious veteran commanders. She urged aggressive attacks on the English fortifications surrounding the city. During one assault, she was wounded by an arrow but returned to the fight, her banner flying high. Her presence broke the siege in just 9 days, a miracle in the eyes of her countrymen. This victory unlocked the Loire campaign, leading to a string of swift successes that cleared the path to Reims. With Joan at his side, Charles VII entered the cathedral city and was crowned King of France in July 1429. She stood beside the altar in her armor, her mission seemingly complete. But political and military reality soon reasserted itself. The following year, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, Joan was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. They sold her to their English masters, who faced a profound problem. They could not execute a victorious French commander as a prisoner of war without making her a martyr. So they devised a more sinister solution. They would destroy her credibility by having the church condemn her as a heretic. Her trial in Rouen was a travesty of justice, a political assassination dressed in theological robes. For months, she was interrogated by pro-English clerics, her every word twisted. The core charge was heresy, focusing on her voices and her insistence on wearing men's clothing, which they argued was an abomination. The trial transcripts, which survive, reveal a teenage girl of astonishing intelligence and resilience, parrying learned theologians with simple, steadfast answers. When asked if she was in God's grace, she replied that if she was not, may God put her there, and if she was, may God keep her there, an answer so wise it stunned the court. They trapped her with a forced abjuration, getting her to sign a document she could not read, renouncing her voices. But when they returned her to prison and forced her back into women's clothes, only to have a guard allegedly attempt to assault her, she put her male attire back on for protection. This relapse allowed them to condemn her as a relapsed heretic. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the Rouen marketplace. The English ordered the ashes scattered in the Seine so no relic could remain, but they could not erase the symbol. Her death guaranteed her immortality. Within 2 years, the Pope annulled the verdict. Charles, now secure on his throne, did little to save her, a cold political calculation that haunts his legacy. The debate over her visions continues. Was she a mystic, a strategic genius, or a combination of both? Modern analyses suggest she may have suffered from a form of epilepsy or other neurological condition that could produce auditory and visual hallucinations, but this does nothing to diminish the staggering historical impact of her conviction. The most iconic visuals of Joan are a study in contrast: the wide-eyed, androgynous peasant girl in medieval manuscripts, the heroic bronze statues on horseback that dot the French landscape, and the countless film depictions that try to capture her otherworldly fervor. Her legacy was ultimately co-opted by the French state, transforming the girl who heard saints into the patron saint of France itself, a unifying symbol of resistance and purity of will. She proved that the most powerful political force could be a story, and that a story, in the right voice, could turn the tide of history. The fire of Joan's martyrdom was still a distant future when another young woman took up arms to defend her homeland. In the misty, war-torn landscape of early 10th century England, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, was not hearing saintly voices. She was issuing military commands. As the daughter of Alfred the Great, she was raised in a kingdom fighting for its very survival against Viking invaders. Her marriage to Æthelred, Lord of Mercia, was a strategic alliance between the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. But when her husband fell ill and later died, the Mercian nobles did not look for a distant male relative to lead them. They turned to his widow. They acclaimed Æthelflæd as their ruler, their lady. This was not a regency for a child. It was full sovereign power vested in a woman, a rarity in the brutal world of Anglo-Saxon warrior politics. Her first task was immediate. The Viking armies were at her gates. Æthelflæd responded not with passive defense, but with a campaign of brilliant, aggressive fortress building. She became a master of military engineering, constructing a network of fortified towns called burhs across the Midlands. These were not simple wooden palisades. They were sophisticated strongholds with deep ditches, high earthwork ramparts, and garrison troops. Towns like Bridgenorth, Stafford, and Warwick began as her strategic creations. Each burh was placed a day's march from the next, creating a defensive web that could shelter the local population and project Saxon power deep into contested territory. She used these fortresses as springboards for offensive campaigns, methodically pushing the Viking forces back. In 917, she led her army to capture the vital Viking stronghold of Derby, a stunning victory recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The following year, she took Leicester without a fight, its Danish garrison submitting to her authority. Her final campaign was the peaceful surrender of the powerful Viking settlement at York, which pledged loyalty to her just days before her death. This was more than warfare, it was statecraft. Æthelflæd ruled in a seamless political partnership with her brother, King Edward the Elder of Wessex. While he campaigned in the south and east, she secured the Midlands and the north. Their coordinated strategy was a pincer movement on a national scale, a brother-sister alliance that systematically dismantled Viking rule. Chronicles show them planning campaigns together, exchanging territories, and supporting each other's troops. She was his equal in strategy and his essential partner in the grand project of unifying the English lands. This raises a profound historical mystery. Why is Æthelflæd so overshadowed by her famous father, Alfred, in popular memory? The answer lies in the parchment and priorities of later historians. The primary source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, exists in multiple versions. The most famous, the Winchester version kept in Wessex, naturally emphasizes the deeds of Alfred and Edward, subtly minimizing Mercian achievements. Yet the Mercian Chronicle fragment, likely inspired by her own court, sings her praises in extraordinary detail. After her death, the unified kingdom she helped build was ruled by men, and chroniclers often folded her accomplishments into those of her brother and her nephew. A woman who led armies and built towns did not fit the neat narratives of later medieval writers, so her story was condensed, a brilliant footnote to the main tale of male kings. So how did she wield such direct power in a warrior culture? She mastered the art of legitimacy. She was of Alfred's royal blood. She was the respected widow of their previous lord, and most importantly, she delivered victory and security. The Mercian nobility followed her because she was effective. She also skillfully navigated the spiritual landscape, founding churches and likely presenting her rule as a divine mission to protect Christian lands from pagan invaders, much like a Saxon Deborah from the Old Testament. Her legacy is literally embedded in the English soil. The street plans of many Midlands towns still follow the grid of her original burghs. Archaeologists find the remains of her massive defensive banks, silent testaments to her strategic mind. Her story forces us to reimagine the map of England's creation, not as the work of one great king, but as a duet between a brother and a sister, a partnership where a lady with a fortress blueprint was just as crucial as a king with a sword. The golden thread of empire was fraying in Constantinople. Maria of Antioch found herself holding its fragile end as regent for her young son, the Emperor Alexios II Komnenos. She was a Latin princess, raised in the Frankish Crusader states, who had married into the Byzantine imperial family. This marriage was meant to be a bridge between East and West, a diplomatic alliance in an era of crusades and shifting loyalties. But in the insular, proud world of 12th century Constantinople, Maria's foreign birth was a mark she could never erase. When her husband, Emperor Manuel I, died, power passed to their young son, and Maria, as his mother, stepped into the role of regent. This was her right and her duty, but from the very beginning, the court viewed her with suspicion. Her administration quickly became dominated by advisors from her own Latin background, men who spoke with different accents and followed the Roman Church. To the Byzantine aristocracy and the common people of the city, it seemed a foreign cabal was now ruling from the sacred palace, making decisions that favored Western merchants and alien interests. The treasury, drained by her husband's ambitious wars, needed refilling, and Maria's regency imposed harsh taxes, which her Latin advisors were seen as enforcing with particular zeal. The resentment was not just political, it was cultural, a deep-seated xenophobia that saw the Latins as crude, greedy, and heretical. In the glittering mosaics of Hagia Sophia, the serene faces of saints looked down on a capital simmering with hatred for the regent and her court. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped a man who promised to be a purifying fire. Andronikos Komnenos was the emperor's cousin, a charismatic, ruthless prince with a long history of exile, rebellion, and scandal. He was also wildly popular with the masses, who saw in him a true Byzantine patriot, a Komnenos who would cleanse the empire of foreign influence. Andronikos masterfully channeled the public fury, presenting himself as the avenger of Byzantine tradition. He marched on the capital, and the city, ripe for revolt, threw open its gates to him. Maria's regency collapsed almost without a fight. She was arrested, and a sham trial condemned her for treason. The charges were a foregone conclusion, built on the perception that her rule had been a betrayal of the empire's soul. Andronikos first imprisoned her, then, to secure his own usurpation, ordered her execution. She was strangled in her cell, a brutal end for an empress. The mystery of Maria's brief reign is a puzzle of perception versus reality. Was she an incompetent ruler, blindly trusting her countrymen and mismanaging the state? Or was she a capable woman trapped in an impossible position, her every move interpreted through a lens of bitter prejudice? The historical record, written by those who despised her Latins, is overwhelmingly hostile, making it nearly impossible to hear her own voice. Her fate is less a story of personal failure and more a chilling lesson in the politics of xenophobia. She became the perfect scapegoat for the empire's deeper problems, her foreignness the explanation for every hardship. Her murder highlighted the extreme volatility of the late Komnenian dynasty, where family members were both the empire's strength and its most savage predators. Andronikos, the avenging patriot, would soon reveal himself to be a tyrant far worse than any foreign advisor, plunging the empire into a reign of terror that ended with his own gruesome death. Maria's tragedy reminds us that in the high-stakes game of imperial politics, sometimes the greatest liability is not a lack of skill, but simply the place of your birth. The crown of Jerusalem was a heavy inheritance, and Sibylla's head was destined to bear its weight. As the eldest daughter of King Amalric, she was the heiress to a fragile kingdom perpetually on a war footing. Her first husband died young, leaving her a widow with a claim that made her the most pivotal woman in Outremer. The barons, those hard-bitten lords who held the kingdom together by sword and treaty, expected to have a say in her next marriage, for her husband would rule as king. They presented her with a list of suitable candidates, noblemen who could lead armies and negotiate with the neighboring Muslim powers. Sibylla, however, had already made her choice, and it was the one man the barons despised, Guy de Lusignan. Guy was a charming knight from Poitou, but to the native nobility, he was an arrogant newcomer, a man of shallow talent and profound ambition. Their opposition was fierce and unanimous, a wall of political pressure meant to protect the realm. Sibylla's response was a stunning act of royal will. At her coronation in 1186, she took the crown from the patriarch, and in a move that silenced the entire chamber, she placed it on her own head. Then, she turned and crowned Guy herself, declaring him king. It was a breathtaking assertion of her sovereign right to choose, a direct challenge to the baron's power. In that moment, she won her personal battle, but she may have doomed the kingdom. The mystery that has haunted historians for centuries is simple. Why? Was this the reckless act of a woman blinded by love, or the calculated move of a queen determined to show she was no one's puppet? The truth might be a painful mixture of both. Sibylla likely saw in Guy a husband she could control, a man loyal to her alone, unlike the powerful barons who sought to control her. It was a gamble for personal authority, and the stakes were the survival of Jerusalem itself. The consequences were catastrophic and swift. Guy proved to be as poor a king as the barons feared. His political missteps alienated the very lords whose armies he needed. In July 1187, against all sound military advice, Guy marched the entire feudal army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem into the waterless hills near the Sea of Galilee. They were trapped by the forces of the Muslim Sultan Saladin at the Horns of Hattin. Under the blistering sun, the Christian army was annihilated. The true cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, was captured. The king himself was taken prisoner. It was the single greatest military disaster in the history of the Crusader states. With the army destroyed, the kingdom lay defenseless. City after city, castle after castle, fell to Saladin's advancing forces. In October, after a brief siege, Jerusalem itself surrendered. The Holy City, captured by the First Crusade nearly a century before, was lost. The maps of the Levant changed color almost overnight, the shrinking Crusader territories swallowed by Saladin's triumphant banners. Sibylla, showing a courage absent in her husband's strategy, remained in the last major stronghold, the city of Tyre, and later joined Guy at the siege of Acre, an attempt to claw back a foothold. It was there, in the summer of 1190, as a plague swept through the besiegers' camp, that Sibylla died. Her young daughters died with her. With her death, the last direct legitimate link to the kingdom's founding dynasty was broken. Guy's claim to the throne evaporated, and the crown passed to her half-sister, Isabella. The first kingdom of Jerusalem, for all practical purposes, ended with Sibylla. So how do we remember her? The chroniclers of her time, men like William of Tyre and his continuators, are conflicted. They paint her as both a tragic figure, a queen devoted to her husband unto ruin, and as a failed ruler whose personal choice led to national collapse. Modern historians see more nuance. Sibylla operated within a system that gave a woman power only through her marriage, yet punished her fiercely for exercising any choice in the matter. Her act of self-coronation was perhaps the most assertive move by a queen of Jerusalem, yet its result was utter devastation. Was she a fool for love or a sovereign making a terrible mistake? Perhaps she was a queen who understood that her only real power was the power to choose her king, and she exercised that right with fatal consequences. Her story is the sound of a crown clattering to the stone floor of a lost city, a reminder that in medieval politics, a single personal decision could echo through history as the thunder of falling walls. The fall of Jerusalem echoed in a colder, mistier kingdom where a different queen was building bridges of peace. Matilda of Scotland carried a name heavy with history, but she was born an Anglo-Saxon princess called Edith, the daughter of King Malcolm III and the saintly Queen Margaret. When she married King Henry I of England in the year 1100, it was a masterstroke of political symbolism. Henry was a Norman, the son of William the Conqueror, whose invasion had shattered the old Anglo-Saxon order just a generation before. Matilda, with her direct descent from the pre-conquest English royal line, was the living link to that vanquished past. Their union was a powerful message, a deliberate fusion of bloodlines meant to heal a divided realm and tell the conquered English that their new Norman king was now also one of their own. She was not merely a consort, she was a walking peace treaty, her very identity a tool of statecraft. Her court became a sanctuary of learning and piety in a brutal age. Fluent in multiple languages and deeply educated, a rarity for any noblewoman, let alone a Queen Matilda, transformed the royal household into a center of cultural patronage. She commissioned books, supported poets and chroniclers, and corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, including the formidable Archbishop Anselm. Her letters reveal a woman of sharp intellect and diplomatic skill, often mediating between the king and the church. This extensive correspondence hints at a deeper mystery, just how much of England's daily administration passed through her hands. While Henry campaigned in Normandy for years at a time, Matilda was frequently left as the de facto ruler in England, presiding over councils and issuing writs under her own Great Seal. That seal is itself a declaration. It shows her crowned and enthroned, holding a scepter, an image of unambiguous authority. She wielded power not through proclamation, but through persistent, careful influence, a steady hand on the tiller of state. Her most enduring legacy, however, was written not in parchment but in stone and charity. Driven by the profound piety inherited from her mother, Matilda founded the first known leper hospital in London, the Hospital of St. Giles in the Fields, and another in Southwark. Imagine the remains of such a place, not a dark dungeon of suffering, but a sanctuary where the most shunned in society could find care and prayer. She did not just fund these institutions, she was personally involved in their operation, visiting the sick and washing the feet of the poor. This earned her the lasting epithet Matilda the Good Queen, a reputation for benevolence that smoothed the rough edges of Norman rule. Her charity was a political virtue, demonstrating a monarch's Christian duty and fostering loyalty among the common people. To visualize her world, one might look to the famed Bayeux Tapestry, that Norman propaganda of conquest. Matilda's life was the sequel to that story, the delicate needlework of reconciliation that had to follow the brutal stitch of invasion. She proved that a queen's soft power, her learning, her faith, her bloodline could be the strongest mortar for building a lasting kingdom. A kingdom could be a prison, especially if you were its rightful queen. Constance of Hauteville was born into a world of dazzling contradiction, the posthumous daughter of King Roger II of Sicily. Her birthplace was the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, a crossroads of Europe where Byzantine mosaics glittered in Latin churches, Arab scientists worked in royal libraries, and Norman knights enforced a uniquely tolerant rule. As the last legitimate heir of the great Hauteville dynasty, Constance was a precious piece on the continental chessboard. For years, she lived quietly, almost like a nun, her claim to the throne seemingly remote behind a line of male relatives. But deaths have a way of clarifying succession. When her nephew, the childless King William II, died in 1189, the Sicilian crown had no obvious heir except his aunt, the 40-year-old Constance. This should have been a smooth transition, but the Sicilian barons recoiled in horror. Constance was not only a woman, she was married to Henry of Hohenstaufen, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor. To them, accepting Constance meant handing their rich, independent island kingdom over to the German emperor, a fate they considered worse than any foreign invasion. So they made a different choice. They crowned a rival, her illegitimate cousin Tancred, and they took the real heiress prisoner. For years, Constance was held captive by the Sicilian nobility. moved from castle to castle, a living trophy in their rebellion against imperial destiny. Her captivity was not in a dungeon, but in a gilded cage, yet a cage nonetheless. The map of the Mediterranean tells the story, the island of Sicily, a jewel at the center of trade routes, now torn between its Norman past and a German future, with Constance at the violent heart of the struggle. Her husband, now Emperor Henry VI, was a man of relentless ambition. He saw Sicily not as a separate kingdom, but as the vital southern pillar of a universal empire that would dominate Christendom. To secure it, he needed his wife free and on the throne. He launched a brutal invasion, and under this relentless pressure, Tancred's regime began to crumble. On his deathbed, Tancred ordered Constance released, perhaps hoping for mercy for his own family. Finally freed, Constance entered Palermo with Henry in 1194, and they were crowned king and queen of Sicily. But the peace was fragile, built on the point of a German sword. Henry ruled with a harshness that alienated his new subjects, and when he died suddenly of fever in 1197, the kingdom once again threatened to explode. Constance, now in her mid-40s, was left with a 3-year-old son, Frederick, and a crown under siege. This was her moment of transformation, from captive heiress to formidable regent. She acted with stunning decisiveness. First, she broke with her husband's German advisors, sending them packing back across the Alps. She then placed her son under the protection of Pope Innocent III, making him Frederick's feudal lord, a brilliant move that secured the Church's support for his rule. She reconfirmed the ancient privileges of the Sicilian nobles and towns, assuring them that her son would be a Sicilian king, not a German emperor. In a little over a year, she stabilized the realm through savvy diplomacy and a clear appeal to Sicilian identity. But surrounding all her political maneuvers was a deeper, more pervasive mystery, one that touched the divine. Constance was over 40 years old when she gave birth to Frederick. In the 12th century, this was not just unusual, it was nearly miraculous. Chroniclers wrote of it with awe, suggesting that God himself had intervened to preserve the Hauteville line and produce this particular child. The legend grew that Frederick was a pure senex, a child-old man, destined for greatness from the womb. Constance, by association, became seen as a vessel of divine will, a miraculous mother chosen to bear a wonder ruler. This sacred aura became a powerful political tool, shielding the young Frederick with a prophecy of destiny that no baron could easily challenge. Did Constance encourage these tales? It is likely she understood their power. In the mosaics of the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, one can almost sense this crafted legacy, the fusion of Norman, Arab, and Byzantine artistry, creating a visual language of sacred kingship that her son would inherit and amplify. Constance's regency was short. She died in 1198, but her work was perfect. She had secured the Sicilian throne, not for a German empire, but for her extraordinary son. She transformed Frederick's inheritance from a contested imperial province into a recognized, independent kingdom, laying the foundation for his future reign as the Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Her story is one of patience and profound political timing, proving that a legacy secured in captivity can be redeemed by a mother's unwavering strategy. Imperial regalia can feel terribly heavy in uncertain hands. Agnes of Poitou found herself holding the scepter of the Holy Roman Empire in 1056, a realm stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, but her grip was challenged from the very first day. She was the widow of the powerful Emperor Henry III, and now regent for their 6-year-old son, the future Henry IV. Her husband had been a commanding ruler who kept the German princes in check and, uniquely, exerted immense control over the papacy, even appointing popes. He left a stable empire, but also a dangerous expectation of absolute, personal authority that a child could not wield, and a regent queen might not be permitted to. Agnes, a pious and well-intentioned woman, was immediately caught in a vice. On one side, the German dukes, men like the ambitious Archbishop Anno of Cologne, saw a woman's regency as a chance to reclaim the power and autonomy Henry III had stripped from them. They began to circle, demanding concessions, lands, and influence. On the other side, a revolution was brewing in Rome. The reformist papacy, fueled by the ideals of the Cluniac movement, was shaking off imperial control. Their goal was libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church from secular rulers, a direct threat to the very system of imperial dominance her husband had perfected. Agnes was thus attacked on two fronts, by secular princes hungry for power and by a religious movement hungry for independence. Her political responses, however, were seen as disastrous missteps. In an attempt to appease the nobility, she distributed royal lands and rights, a policy that drained the crown's resources and made the monarchy weaker. To handle the church, she often appointed bishops loyal to the reformist cause, hoping to build bridges. Instead, this only accelerated the papacy's emancipation from imperial authority. The most infamous moment came in 1061, when a group of German nobles, led by Archbishop Anno, orchestrated a shocking coup. They invited the young King Henry IV onto a splendid ship on the Rhine River for a festival. Once the boy was aboard, the ship abruptly cast off, carrying him away from his mother's custody. This event, known as the Coup of Kaiserswerth, was a symbolic kidnapping that shattered Agnes's regency. Power was now openly in the hands of the princes. Heartbroken and politically broken, Agnes withdrew from court entirely, eventually retiring to a nunnery. The chroniclers of the time, men like Lambert of Hersfeld, were merciless. They painted her as naive, weak-willed, and incompetent, a woman whose soft heart and poor judgment created a vacuum of power. But the mystery we must confront is this: were her failures truly her own, or was she handed an impossible situation? Could any regent, male or female, have simultaneously contained the German princes and subdued the reformist papacy? Her husband's autocratic style had created pressures that were bound to explode. By being a woman, she became the perfect scapegoat for forces that were far larger than any single ruler. Her regency did not cause the coming storm, but it failed to prevent it, and in doing so, it set the stage for the defining conflict of the next generation. The weakened monarchy and the emboldened papacy she left behind became the preconditions for the investiture controversy, the epic struggle between her son, Henry IV, and Pope Gregory VII over who appointed bishops. That conflict would lead to excommunications, civil wars, and the iconic scene of an emperor standing barefoot in the snow at Canossa. Agnes's story is often told as a prologue to that great drama, a tale of maternal failure. But perhaps it is better understood as a tragedy of timing, where the crown's weight proved too great, not because the bearer was a woman, but because the foundations of imperial power were already cracking beneath it. The crown of Burgundy was woven from gold thread and shifting alliances. Isabella of Portugal arrived in Flanders in 1429, a Portuguese infante whose marriage to Duke Philip the Good was a masterstroke of commercial diplomacy, binding the wealthy Burgundian trading ports to the burgeoning sea power of Portugal. She stepped into the most opulent court in northern Europe, a realm that was technically part of France but operated as a sovereign power, a glittering, ambitious state caught between the giants of England and France during the 100 Years' War. Isabella was far more than a decorative consort. She was Philip's trusted political partner and his chief diplomat, a role that would demand every ounce of her skill. Her greatest test came in 1435, with the negotiation of the Treaty of Arras. For years, Burgundy had been allied with England against the French crown, a partnership born from the brutal assassination of Philip's, fathered by the French Dauphin. The war was a drain on Burgundy's resources and a constant threat to its stability. To secure a lasting peace, someone had to convince the proud, grieving Duke Philip to turn his back on his English allies and reconcile with the French king. That someone was Isabella. She presided over the complex, months-long Congress at Arras, mediating between the French, the Burgundian, and even the papal delegations. Her success was a monumental achievement in personal statecraft. The treaty formally ended the Burgundian Civil War with France, and in return, Philip received significant territorial concessions and, most importantly, a royal pardon that functionally recognized his autonomy. This pivot reshaped the map of Europe, weakening England's position and allowing Burgundy to flourish as a neutral power. Isabella's influence was woven into the very fabric of Burgundian culture. She was a discerning patron, her taste helping to shape the Northern Renaissance. She commissioned works from the finest artists like Rogier van der Weyden, whose portraits capture her serene, intelligent gaze, a woman aware of her own authority. The famed Burgundian tapestries, those sprawling, wool and silk narratives of courtly love and biblical scenes, often produced in workshops she supported, were not just decorations, they were tools of soft power, displaying the dynasty's wealth, piety, and sophistication to every visiting ambassador. Her court at Brussels or Bruges was a theater of politics, where the lavish feasts, tournaments, and ceremonies she organized were calculated displays meant to overawe subjects and rivals alike. Yet a profound mystery surrounds her later years and her relationship with her only surviving son, Charles, who would become known as Charles the Bold. After Philip's death, Charles pursued a relentlessly aggressive, militaristic policy aimed at forging a contiguous kingdom from the North Sea to the Alps, a policy that would ultimately lead to his ruin and the dismantling of the Burgundian state. How much did Isabella influence this headstrong, combative duke? Some historians suggest her earlier diplomacy, which secured such gains through negotiation, might have shown Charles that boldness paid. Others wonder if, in his drive to outshine his father's legacy, he deliberately rejected his mother's more conciliatory methods. Isabella spent her final years in a manor she had built, somewhat removed from the whirlwind of her son's court. Was this a peaceful retirement, or a strategic withdrawal from policies she could not support? Her correspondence from this period is sparse, leaving her final thoughts on the looming catastrophe a silent enigma. Isabella of Portugal mastered the art of the possible, navigating a web of loyalties to build a fragile peace, only to watch the next generation unravel it with dreams of conquest. Her story lives in the serene face of a van der Weyden portrait and in the intricate, fragile beauty of a tapestry, reminders that the most dazzling courts are often balanced on the knife's edge of diplomacy. Her voice emerged from a room with no door, in a small cell attached to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich. A woman known only as Juliana chose to be sealed away from the world, an anchoress. From this permanent enclosure, where she would spend perhaps 20 years, she wrote something revolutionary, Revelations of Divine Love, the first book in English known to be authored by a woman. Her world outside was one of profound trauma. The Black Death had swept through England repeatedly, killing half the population, and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 had shaken the social order to its core. In the midst of this chaos and grief, Juliana received a series of 16 visions, or showings, centered on the Passion of Christ. She spent decades contemplating their meaning, and her written account became a theological anchor for a society adrift. Her theology was startlingly intimate. She described God not only as Father, but explicitly as Mother, a comforting, nurturing presence who loves humanity with the fierce, unconditional care of a parent. Her most famous phrase, repeated like a mantra, offered a radical hope: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This was not a naive denial of suffering. Juliana wrote vividly of sin and pain, but a profound assertion of ultimate cosmic goodness. In an age of mass death and social violence, this message provided a spiritual framework for endurance, a way to process unbearable loss without despair. The mystery of Juliana is almost absolute. We do not know her birth name, her family, or her life before she entered the Anchorhold. Her chosen name comes from the church to which she was attached. Everything we know of her comes from the interior landscape of her book. How could a woman walled into a single room exert any influence? Her authority flowed from her perceived holiness. People would come to a small, shuttered window in her cell, the Squint, to seek her counsel. She became a spiritual advisor, a living symbol of devotion in a city scarred by plague. Her writings, carefully copied and circulated among devout circles, offered a new, accessible spirituality in the English vernacular, not scholarly Latin. This was a quiet power, but a deep one. By framing divine love as the ultimate reality, she indirectly challenged a social order built on fear and hierarchy. If God is a loving mother and all shall ultimately be well, then the desperation and rage fueling peasant revolts could be met with a call to patient, hopeful resilience. Her work did not preach political change. It offered a spiritual alternative to the world's brutality. which in itself was a stabilizing force. Visualize the stark contrast: the grim, crowded streets of a medieval town after a plague outbreak, and then the quiet, bare cell with its single window. A page from her manuscript illuminated by a thin beam of light, the careful Middle English script spelling out her comforting words. Juliana of Norwich proves that influence can be a whisper from a sealed room, a voice that changes not laws, but hearts, and in doing so, steadies a trembling world. The high crosses of Ireland stand silent against a misty sky, their intricate knots telling stories of faith and lineage. In the shadows of these stone monuments, a queen moved with a purpose as sharp as the carving tools. Gormflaith in Gen Merchada was born into the heart of 11th century Gaelic politics, a daughter and sister to kings of Leinster. Her life was not her own, but a series of strategic moves on a board where Gaelic kingdoms and Viking settlements clashed and merged. She was married first to the Viking king of Dublin, Olaf Cuaran, a union that bound the Irish of Leinster to the Norse Gaelic power of the eastern coast. After his death, she was wed to the High King of Ireland himself, Brian Boru, the legendary figure who had risen from the Kingdom of Munster to claim the High Kingship through sheer force and political genius. And when that marriage fractured, she married yet another king, Mael Suchnail of Meath, 3 husbands, each a ruler of a major power block. This was not romantic fortune, it was the stark reality of dynastic statecraft. Gormflaith was the living treaty, the human bond meant to secure alliances between the ever-shifting Gaelic dynasties and the entrenched Viking towns. Her son from her first marriage, Sitric Silkbeard, was King of Dublin, a man caught between his Viking heritage and his mother's Gaelic lineage. The stage was set for a catastrophe, and Gormflaith stood at its center. The trigger was an insult, a deep and personal one. After her separation from Brian Boru, Gormflaith returned to her brother's court in Leinster. The annals tell us that Brian's son, perhaps distrusting this formidable former queen, raided Leinster and publicly humiliated Gormflaith, an act that struck at the very core of her family's honor. From this point, the legend takes over. Gormflaith is cast as the vengeful schemer, the woman scorned who masterminds the great coalition against Brian Boru. She is said to have goaded her brother, the King of Leinster, into rebellion, and to have persuaded her son, the King of Dublin, to call in Viking allies from across the sea, including the fierce warriors of the Orkneys and the Isle of Man. The result was the Battle of Clontarf, fought on Good Friday in the year 1014. It was a brutal, day-long struggle just outside the walls of Dublin. The maps show a chaotic clash, with Brian Boru's forces from Munster and Connacht facing a combined army of rebellious Leinstermen and a vast Viking host. When the fighting ended, the High King was dead, slain in his tent, but so too was Gormflaith's brother, the King of Leinster, and in the carnage, her own son from her marriage to Brian Boru, a young prince named Donchad, also perished. In one day, the battle orchestrated in her name claimed her husband, her brother, and her child. The mystery that hangs over Gormflaith is thick as Irish fog. Was she truly the malevolent puppet master, a classic medieval stereotype of the manipulative woman who brings ruin to men? Or was she a canny political actor, a woman using every tool at her disposal, marriage, persuasion, family ties, to navigate a system that gave her no formal power except through the men around her? Her actions, even in the legendary telling, can be read as a desperate attempt to restore her family's standing after a grave insult, a move any Gaelic lord would have made. The interplay of Gaelic and Viking power was a tangled web, and Gormflaith, with her feet in both worlds, was perhaps trying to secure a future for her son Sitric in Dublin. The tragedy is that the system she navigated so expertly ultimately consumed everything she sought to protect. The imagery of her legacy is stark, the serene, eternal circles of a high cross juxtaposed with the chaotic, bloody mud of Clontarf. She becomes a warning and a question, a reminder that in the brutal calculus of medieval politics, the architects of war are often its most shattered victims. The walls of Constantinople were not just stone, but a fading dream. In the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, a realm shrinking under relentless pressure from all sides. Within this fragile world, a woman from the west stepped into the heart of its last dynasty. Theodora Paleologina was a princess of Montferrat, from the Italian Piedmont, and her marriage to Andronikos II Palaiologos was a strategic bridge, connecting the fading empire to Latin Christendom. When her husband, the co-emperor, embarked on lengthy military campaigns to defend the empire's crumbling frontiers in Asia Minor, the capital was left in Theodora's hands as regent. Her test was immediate and brutal. A severe famine struck the city, and as its people grew desperate, a new and terrifying mercenary army appeared at the empire's doorstep, the Catalan Company. This band of battle-hardened Spanish soldiers, originally hired by the Byzantines, had turned into a rogue, marauding force, pillaging the countryside and threatening to besiege Constantinople itself. Theodora faced this dual crisis of hunger and invasion with a steady hand. She organized grain distributions, appealed to the church for aid, and, critically, opened negotiations with the Catalans. Her diplomacy was a delicate dance of threat and concession, buying time and space for the imperial armies to regroup. All the while, she had to navigate the treacherous waters of the Palaiologan court, where her son's rights were constantly challenged by factions supporting her husband's first wife. Her regency was a masterclass in holding a fractured state together by sheer administrative will. Beyond crisis management, Theodora sought to bolster the empire's spirit. She became a significant patron of the arts and the church, funding the restoration of monasteries and the creation of religious manuscripts. In an empire that viewed Latins with deep suspicion, her Western origins could have been a liability, but she turned them into an asset. She maintained a sophisticated diplomatic correspondence with Western powers, including the Pope and the King of France, using her family connections and cultural understanding to lobby for aid or, at the very least, to prevent new crusades from being directed against Constantinople. The mystery that clouds her legacy is her final act. After years of effective rule, she suddenly retired to the convent of St. Andrew in Constantinople, taking the monastic name Theodule. Was this the voluntary, pious retreat of a devout woman, a common conclusion for Byzantine empresses, or was it a forced removal, a polite exile engineered by a court or a husband that no longer needed or trusted her influence? The historical record is silent on the motive, leaving us to wonder if the convent's quiet cloister was a chosen sanctuary or a gilded cage. Her story is visualized in the last, brilliant flashes of late Byzantine art, in the emotionally charged icons and the intricate mosaics of the Chora Church, which was renovated around her time. These works glow with a poignant beauty, a final assertion of identity against the encroaching dark. Theodora Palaiologina proves that authority in a dying empire is the most fragile kind, a flame kept alive through careful breath, until the moment the wind finally changes direction. Her name on a French charter was written in a script from the East. Anne of Kiev, the final figure in our list of 30, arrived in the Frankish kingdom as a bride from a world most Europeans considered the distant edge of the map. She was the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, the great ruler of Kievan Rus, whose court in present-day Ukraine was a beacon of Christian learning and Byzantine splendor. Her marriage to King Henry I of France in 1051 was a diplomatic coup, connecting the Capetian dynasty to a rising power and, according to some chroniclers, bringing a much-needed infusion of royal blood and gold. When Henry died in 1060, their son Philip was just 7 years old. Anne did not fade into the background of a monastery. She stepped forward as regent, her signature suddenly vital on every document of state. And that signature was a statement in itself. While her late husband, the King of France, could only mark charters with a cross, Queen Anne could read and write. She signed her name in the distinctive characters of the Cyrillic alphabet, a stark, elegant reminder of her origins in the sophisticated, literate court of her father. In a realm where many nobles were functionally illiterate, the Queen's learning was not just a personal accomplishment, it was a tool of power, allowing her to personally oversee administration and diplomacy. Her regency, shared with the Count of Flanders, was focused on preserving the throne for her son, navigating the inevitable plots of ambitious magnates who saw a child king as an opportunity. She succeeded, and Philip I was securely crowned, but Anne's influence likely ran deeper than political guardianship. She brought with her the cultural and spiritual currents of Kievan Rus, a realm deeply tied to Constantinople. The visual world she knew was one of golden-domed cathedrals like St. Sophia in Kiev, their interiors covered in shimmering mosaics and frescoes, a stark contrast to the heavier, Romanesque architecture of 11th century France. Did she introduce new artistic ideas, or perhaps different devotional practices? The historical record is silent on specifics, but her very presence created a living bridge between Eastern and Western Christendom at a time before the Great Schism had fully hardened. This connection gives rise to one of the most enduring legends attached to her name. It is said that Anne of Kiev was responsible for introducing the name Philip to Western Europe, choosing it for her son. The name, of Greek origin meaning lover of horses, was common in the Byzantine sphere, but virtually unknown in France. If the story is true, it was a profound act of cultural imprinting, planting a seed from her homeland that would blossom into a name for countless future French kings. Her personal story took another remarkable turn in her later years. Some years after King Henry's death, Anne remarried, not to a powerful Frankish lord, but to Count Ralph IV of Valois, a man of high nobility. This match caused a scandal, as Count Ralph was already married, and his first wife appealed to the Pope. The resulting excommunication and political turmoil forced Anne to retreat from court for a time, a reminder that even a queen's choices were subject to the rigid laws of the Church. She eventually returned to royal favor, living out her days in her dower lands, her legacy secured in the survival of her son's line. The mystery of Anne is not one of dramatic rebellion or open warfare, but of subtle, cultural transmission. How does a woman from the frontier of Europe leave her mark on the heart of France? It may be in the quiet confidence of a signature, in the choice of a royal name, in the unseen influence on the tastes and devotions of a court that had never seen a queen quite like her. She represents the quiet, pervasive power of the outsider who brings not just an alliance, but a whole unseen world into the halls of power, changing them in ways too subtle for chroniclers to fully record, but enduring enough to echo in a name repeated down the centuries. And so our journey through the corridors of forgotten power comes to a close. We have walked alongside 30 astonishing women who defied the rigid constraints of their age, from the hippodrome stages of Constantinople to the anchor holds of Norwich, from the mountain fortresses of Tuscany to the shifting sands of Outremer. Each one, whether empress, queen, regent, or rider, found a way to rule, advise, rebel, and negotiate in a world meticulously designed to exclude their voices. They did not wait for permission, they seized influence through intellect, courage, and an unbreakable will, leaving indelible marks on the maps and laws of their time. Their stories are often profound mysteries, pieced together from chronicles written by their detractors, from legal documents bearing their unique seals, and from the silent, enduring evidence of the monasteries, universities, and fortifications they built. This fragmentary evidence makes their documented achievements all the more remarkable, each charter and chronicle entry a hard-won victory against oblivion. Remember, the grand narrative of history is not written solely on battlefields by kings in armor. It is also composed in palace chambers by a queen's decisive word, in a scriptorium by a widow's steady pen, and from a prison cell by a mother's relentless strategy. The true medieval mystery is how we ever thought these women were absent from the story. Their legacy asks us to listen more closely to the past, to hear the whispers that have been drowned out for centuries. Which of these hidden architects of history intrigued you the most? Was it the defiant tragedy of Sibylla of Jerusalem, the administrative genius of Margaret Beaufort, or the spiritual revolution of Juliana from her quiet cell? Let your voice join the rediscovery in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows where history's light so rarely falls, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. There are countless more mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and we are just getting started.